Hey guys, in this video, we're going to continue to look at generational mapping or gen mapping as a way to fuel your prayer life. So we all know that movements do not continue to grow or sustain without abundant prayer. Throughout history, as we've seen movements among groups like the Moravians, the Quakers, John Wesley and the Methodists, and more recent, the student movement, and more recent movements that are happening right now around the world. There's many movements that are taking place right now to multiple generations. These do not continue or sustain without abundant prayer. And so what is a way that we can begin to fuel our prayer life as we want to be a part of sustaining the work of God through us and through the leaders that God brings to us? Well, there's many tools out there that you can use. Some use what's called the prayer wheel or prayer cycle. That's really useful. Some people create prayer calendars in which they are putting names of people that they're going to share with and pray for on that day of the month. Those are great things, and other people include unreached people groups, and they're praying for a new group every day. All those are great structures. But today we're going to look at a way that you can pray specifically into the lives of your disciples using generational mapping. In the last video, we unpacked what gen mapping is. I encourage you to watch that if you haven't. In this video, we're going to look at this made-up gen map. None of this is real, but this is going to help to kind of show you a way that I use gen mapping to pray. So let's unpack this. We see here this existing believer church, and that's what this square means. Again, if it was a green square, it would be a legacy church, but because it's a black square, it's a church of existing believers. It identifies as church because it's a solid line, not a dashed line. And we see it's pretty healthy. All the practices that you might find in healthy church is happening here, and there's these 12 practices. Not going to go into that right now. You can check out the church circle video for what that is. We also see all of the different components and practice of the 3/3 happening. There is consistent care happening among these believers. There's let's see, scroll down to where that is. There's consistent care, worship, accountability is happening, vision casting is happening regularly. We see that new teaching is being introduced, and practice, very critical, and goal setting and commissioning. All these are checked on this existing believer church here, so we see that it's actually happening in the church. Okay, so now let's look at some of their leaders, those faithful few they're pouring into that have started new groups. 2 of them are with existing believers, and looks like this is mainly with existing believers, and they're not seeing, there's a 0 out here on baptism, so there's not been a whole lot of new multiplication fruit. But nonetheless, they're sharing the gospel. We see that happening consistently. This group has got the prayer icon inside of it. This group is missing the prayer icon. So already we can see that as we're talking about prayer, prayer is critical to seeing multiplication happen. And so one way that we could pray for this group, leader 1, is that God would begin to raise up a heart and a passion for prayer among them. And so that there's obviously, in terms of just discipleship, that we need to really focus in on how can we disciple them into living out a lifestyle of prayer, read a story on prayer, and then begin to practice that with them, introduce a tool like the prayer wheel, prayer cycle, or a prayer calendar. But even more than that, we can pray for prayer to begin to happen within that community. So we also see some of the components of 3/3 is missing here. Accountability and vision casting is lacking. So that may be because they don't really have clarity of vision. Maybe that means that I haven't done a good job as the launch church leader of casting vision to them or communicating the importance of vision. But I can begin to pray that maybe it's just that God hasn't really given them a clear focus of vision for their church yet. So I can pray that God would give them that clear focus, and then continue to ask them what their big vision is until it becomes clear and God has spoken to them. Also, accountability is not taking place. So I can, of course, model this and should be modeling this, doing a lesson on why accountability is important, and checking back on the things that we're training to them each week. But then I can begin to ask them about those disciples that they're making. There's disciples in this church. And if accountability isn't happening, it's going to become evident pretty quickly in that their disciples are not going to be able to train back to me the things that they're learning. So I can regularly ask them, hey, if I ask your disciple to train back to me this particular tool or this particular story, could they do it? And then alongside all of this, as we're talking about today, I can begin to pray, Lord, would you begin to raise up among this community radical obedience to put into practice what they're learning and to check back with one another on that. So of course there's modeling and assisting, but then I can also be praying into what God is doing there. Okay, so let's talk about this middle group. This is where I want to focus most of the time today, because this group is new believers and it's not yet a church, but it's multiplying into the harvest, into lostness. That's exciting. So it's a small group. They've got 3 people in it. One person is a new believer. One person is a believer. They got 2 new believers. And then we see within this group some missing components in the 3/3 process. Now, of course, again, we're going to be praying into these things, but they're giving away what they're learning. So I want to focus on that there is a clear giving away and multiplication, and they're sharing the gospel, but they're just not really, they may not have yet vision for what it looks like to be a disciple that is accountable and sharing. Some of that's on me for modeling. A lot of that's on me for modeling and assisting them in this. But also, again, I can be praying into this. Lord, would you begin to move in this church and begin to raise up a clear vision, raise up accountability among them, raise up these consistent goals. And then I can learn what those are from them, what it is that they're learning. And I can begin to say, Lord, would you begin to multiply this particular story or this particular tool among this church? And then also, as this is multiplying to the next generation, we see here that there is some fruit of multiplication. They're sharing. And I'm going to begin to ask that God would continue with this church, with 2 new believers here, to continue to give them boldness to share with their oikos. So the fact that there's unbelievers in this church and they're clearly sharing, I'm going to ask God for continued boldness to share and for fruit, that God would bring in the harvest as they share with their relational network. And clearly they've got some fruit here, that God would bring God-prepared people, even infamous people like John 4, this woman at the well, or Mark 5, this demoniac, that God would, through these unbelievers, begin to bring to them those that would be God prepared and begin to reach their whole network as well. So you begin to see how this network map, this Gen map, is fuel for my prayer life. And all of these grayed out icons that are not yet solid, yes, this is coaching opportunities, yes, this is discipleship opportunities, but it's also for me to pray that God would begin to give vision for these things within this group. So I think what's helpful is to understand that these go hand in hand, that we don't convince people or train them alone to get a hold of this stuff. It's the Spirit of God that gives us vision and revelation for what it really looks like to love our neighbor, what it really looks like to pray. And yes, we're going to dig into the scripture, but as we do that, we're going to pray that God would begin to raise up these truths and realities within these particular groups and churches. So I hope that's helpful. This is just a kind of a launch point, and as this begins to fill out with more, you'll be thankful for having this ability to keep track. Now, I don't pray past this point of my spiritual grandchildren, because at some point, if I'm praying for if we use that analogy, the 139, if I'm praying not only for my 3, but also my 9, and then the 27, and it just starts to become a lot more than I personally can keep up with. But I can pray for my 1, for my 3, and then for this next generation as that becomes 9. And then from there, train them in praying for their 3 and for their 9. And this gives you a specific vision for the things that might need to be leaned into with those 3, so that those 3 become 9, and then they begin to cast vision to their own few to pray for a faithful few more so that it multiplies. So again, churches, planting churches, disciples making disciples, the fruit of multiplication comes with abundant prayer and abundant sowing of the gospel. So we can be praying into the sowing of the gospel radically, but we want to be consistently, regularly, and specifically praying. And again, I think that's one of the keys, is that when we just pray general prayers, God, would you come and move, or God, would you help people? we have not because we ask not. That's what the book of James tells us. And so we can learn how to get really specific in our prayers. And that begins with understanding, first of all, what's the situation that's actually happening on the ground with our disciples and with their disciples. And then we can begin to take that information to pray specifically into church health, healthy DNA, and into multiplication as these different components of the 3/3 begin to happen over time through prayer, through modeling, through assisting as we launch them out. Hope that's helpful, guys. And if you haven't already, check out my first video on generational mapping. And 139 is another really helpful component of what this looks like to pour into the faithful few. And I'll talk to you again soon.